Hello, and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Neill McFarland, and today we have with us Bill McElvaney, Professor Emeritus of Theology. Bill, it's a real pleasure to chat with you here today. You grew up in the shadow of SMU, as I recall, and have had a long time relationship to this university.
I did indeed. Both my parents attended SMU in the earliest days. My mother did graduate, I believe it was 1920,
Really?
in English.
Yeah.
And my father came here but never graduated. He went overseas in the First World War, but we were sort of stamped with red and blue almost in the cradle. And my brother also came here briefly before he went in the V12 program.
Mm-hmm. But then you eventually enrolled here as an undergraduate student. What year was that?
I came to SMU in 1946 from Highland Park High School.
Yes. Well, that was just after the end of World War II, and you had some company on campus.
We did. We had at least two distinct cultures, I might call them. We had many returning veterans from the World War, and they, of course, were older and they were very experienced and had had some very harrowing experiences in some cases. And then the other culture consisted of those of us who came greenhorns out of high school.
Yeah.
And the campus those days, as I remember, the student center was a prefab building.
Right.
So that goes back quite a ways.
And there were residences on campus too that were temporary.
There were indeed.
Close to
You would not recognize the campus then as it now is.
Right. Well, now what was your major field at that time?
I decided to major in business administration, and I got a double major in banking and finance and accounting. I then stayed an extra year into 1951 and obtained a master's degree in business administration. So I really hadn't thought as much about my future as I learned later that I hadn't, but that seemed to be the way I wanted to go at that time, and I enjoyed the classes and being here on the campus and was involved in a lot of campus activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, you left here then with 2 degrees.
2 degrees.
And where did they lead you?
Well, they led me into the business world. I worked for a year and a half at the Highland Park State Bank over on Preston Road. And then I went with Continental Oil Company as an oil scout, and I lived in Amarillo for a year and in Fort Worth for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I was in a program to be trained to be a landman. And if I had not had the call to ordained ministry as I perceived it, I probably would have gone to Abilene as a landman, and my life would have been very different.
Very different. Yeah. But then you came back to the Perkins School of Theology in '54. I remember that because that was the fall that I began teaching in the Perkins School of Theology. And Jim Kirby was also in that entering class. Are there others in that class that you recall that have gone on to distinction?
Well, quite a few. I think the one that would be recognized most by the listeners, reviewers of this tape would be Bob Short of the Gospel According to Peanuts fame.
Yes.
I think Bob's books have been published up to about 10 million or something like that, but Bob was in the class. Joe Hale, who is the General Secretary of the the World Methodist Council, was in our class, and then some dear friends like Eb Munden and Ray Bratton and some others. Mm-hmm. And in those days, most of the students were just out of college.
Yes.
Today, of course, most of our students in seminaries are second career students or maybe third career, but I was one of a few of those at that time, having worked for 3 years.
Yes.
So our whole age level would be quite younger than would be the case today.
Yeah, they looked up to you, no doubt.
Well, I don't know about that, but we all suffered and learned together.
Well, I suppose then you finished your degree in '57, would it be?
Mm-hmm.
And where then did you go?
I went to Union Theological Seminary in New York City.
Yes.
This was not a degree plan, but it was a 9-month program. I especially wanted to study under Dr. Paul Scherer. He was a great
Yes.
Lutheran preacher and teacher. I had heard about him from other Perkins students who had gone there. So I was one of 5 bachelors that got a apartment off of Broadway, and there's about 5 blocks from Union Seminary. And so we would usually walk up to the school, and then that year I served as an assistant in a Presbyterian church in Englewood, New Jersey. It was a wonderful year. I learned a lot. I also had Reinhold Niebuhr as one of my professors, Terry Ann and some others.
Did this lead to a degree, or was this just...
No, it was just a 9-month special studies
I see.
program.
Was it at that point then that you came back to, you came back to Dallas at that point, I
came
suppose.
back to Dallas. I thought I had an agreement with my bishop to start a new church. That was my dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had been led to believe that I would either start a new church in Lubbock or in some other area of the jurisdiction. And then, so when I got back, I went down to New Orleans to see my brother. I hadn't seen him for quite a while, and I came back to our conference while it was in session, thinking I was going to transfer to the Northwest Texas Conference. Well, I walked in the steps of First Methodist, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, Mac, I hear you're going to be in the Denton District." And I said, "Denton District?" I said, "Man, I'm not even going to be in this conference." "Well, that's not what I've heard. I think you better see the district superintendent." So I went to see the district superintendent. He said, "I think you better see the bishop." And so I was really getting worried about them. So the situation had closed out for a new church, would have been in Lubbock. And so I was offered the opportunity to be an assistant in Amarillo, where I had worked with Continental Oil Company, or to go to Justin, Texas as pastor. Well, I didn't even know where Justin was. I had to ask, and I asked the bishop, "Well, how long do I have to decide?" And he said, "Well, until I read the appointment. It's the day after next." So I got myself together and decided to go to Justin. So that was my first experience in rural America, so to speak. And I still remember, I was still a bachelor. I remember waking up that first morning in the parsonage, and this rooster was crowing. It was about 5:30 in the morning, and this light kind of dawned in my brain that said, that's what they meant in seminary by ontological shock. But it was a good year, and so I served out that year in Justin.
And then came back to Dallas?
I came back to Dallas. I was offered the opportunity to start a church out in Mesquite, actually in the middle of the conference year, and I decided against that. I thought that's an insult to people in Justin to leave in the middle of the year because it's something I want to do. And so I kind of crossed my fingers and said, "If you'll hold that till June, I have no right to ask you that, but if you decide to do that, I would do that in June after I finish my year." So I started, at that time it was called the Oates Drive Methodist Church, and it was supported by the new church program, particularly through Highland Park United Methodist Church, where I had grown up and had been baptized and confirmed. So I like to say the bishop appointed me to a vacant lot. So I went out to Mesquite and started knocking on doors, and after a while we gathered together a congregation, and I served at St. Stephen for 8 years. It was still one of the great experiences of my life.
It's still a strong church, I understand.
Still a strong church. They're very community oriented, and they do a lot of things with, through, and for people in the community. But I might relate just when I started my survey right across the street from the vacant lot, I knocked on the door, and I was really excited about this survey, and it was a hot day in June of 1959. So this housewife came to the door and kind of yanked the door open and had kind of a bandana around her head with a mop in her hand, and she looked at me and she said, "What do you want, boy?" I felt kind of like I said, well, skip it, never mind. But I found that at least half of the population were various stripes of Baptists and a very strong Church of Christ group. But we had probably about 12 or 15% United Methodist, or just Methodist at that time. We weren't united then, as we're supposed to be now. So it was a great experience. We met in elementary school, and then we built our building, which was the first free-form church building in America. So it was an exciting time.
Our good friend Bob Elliott's funeral service was held in that church.
Bob was very important. He was there during the part of the time when I was pastor. And when I became ill in the summer of 1966, Bob kind of stepped in and really served as a kind of an interim pastor for several weeks, and it just meant so much to me. And among other things, it taught me how that I was not indispensable to the church. So that's always a good thing for pastors to learn.
Well, now that was the first of two churches that you started in this area, wasn't it? Was it not, or did you?
No, I went from St. Stephen to North Haven United Methodist Church.
But you did not start that.
No, that was started actually by Addison Cutter several years ago, and he was followed by Bill Holmes, and then by Jim Harris for 1 year. And so I went there in 1967.
And stayed for how long?
I stayed at North Haven for 6 years. This was a very chaotic, tumultuous time in our society during the Vietnam War, fair housing issues, the civil rights movement. So I spoke out on those kind of issues and tried to make a witness and set an example as I saw the gospel leading me to do.
That tradition has been continued in that church, hasn't it?
It has indeed.
Yes.
Has indeed.
Well, at last then you're getting into theological education from that point, aren't you? That is, you went from there to Kansas City?
Yes, I went to Kansas City in 1973 as president of a fairly new seminary. It's sort of Perkins' colleague or counterpart in the north part of our jurisdiction.
Right.
So I served at St. Paul for 12 years, and I suppose they were looking for somebody who could read a financial sheet and who had a theological background. So it was a good connection.
And you finished there in what year?
I finished there in 1985, as it turned out. Jim Kirby and I would visit during the sessions of the Association of United Methodist Theological Schools.
Jim was the dean of Perkins at
by that time. He was dean at Perkins, having come from Drew. So we would meet, and he began to talk to me about the possibility of coming to Perkins, or at least interviewing with the faculty to do so. I didn't really think I wanted to do that. I was happy doing what I was doing at St. Paul. But after about a year, I began to think, I know that Fran and I will return to Dallas when I retire, and maybe this would be a good time. And I began to think I had accomplished maybe what I could best do at St. Paul. The chair that was to be open was the Levan chair in preaching and worship. I was reasonably certain that I could teach preaching, at least in an adequate way. I was less sure about worship. And the reason was that you can teach preaching without a pretty vast knowledge of the history of preaching, although that helps you, of course. But you cannot do that in worship or liturgy. Yes. You have to know the history of the liturgy, at least in the Western Church, to be a responsible and effective professor in that field. So I was a little concerned about that, but I did come and did interview, and was graciously received by the faculty and administration, and so I was offered that position. So we moved back to Dallas in 1985, and by that time our two children were in the process of growing up, and so lots had happened in those 12 years.
Well, I want to pursue with you your career at Perkins, but may I back up just a little for a moment? Your father was for some time the chairman of the Board of Trustees here at SMU. And I remember him very, very favorably. As a matter of fact, I was in the provost job at the time that he was in that position, and I found him to be a man of just impeccable honesty. And I remember one of the weeks in the history of this school when we lost 3 people. The first was my first wife, June, who died of cancer on June the 10th of 1971. About 2 days later, Red Barr, who was the very popular and successful swimming coach, died of a heart attack. And a day or 2 later, your father died also, so that in 1 week's time, we had 3 funerals here and lost 3 very great people. Can you tell us something about your father's career and interest in SMU?
He had a long attraction to SMU. He grew up in Denison, Texas, in a family of 7 siblings, and he knew about this new school that was going to start in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And the family story is that he saved $12 from his paper route in Denton when he was a senior in Denison High School, and sent that to help begin SMU. And so he had a forward-looking tug and vision toward SMU early on. And when he became chair, it did occupy a lot of his time and effort. And my dad was able to raise a lot of money for SMU. There is a McElvaney Hall. He didn't give the money for that, but I don't think we had that kind of money. But he certainly raised a lot of money. He raised some money from Bob Hope and Bing Crosby and a thing called the Ponies Oil Corporation, which he wrote an article about it for the Reader's Digest. I always maintained nobody could understand it. It was so complex except my dad and maybe a few others. But he did serve as trustee for a number of years and was chair of the board when he died. And another family story was that there were stretches of time when it seemed, at least, as though Dad had breakfast with Willis Tate, the president, with whom he was very close more often than he did at home. Yeah. But we were all thrilled and grateful for his contribution to SMU.
He was Eugene McElvaney, mm-hmm. And he did indeed make very substantial contributions to this university. His integrity, I think, is just unmatched in the history of the university.
And you know, Neil, I've had always had mixed feelings about the fact that Dad died before the SMU football scandal, because on the one hand, I guess I'm glad he didn't know about it. Yeah. On the other hand, I thought if he'd been living, maybe that wouldn't have happened. So who knows?
we will never know, but we know where he would have stood in that particular issue. Well, back to your career at Perkins. 1985 was the beginning date of your return.
Of a faculty member.
As a faculty member. Mm-hmm.
So I've experienced Perkins in just about every way you can experience it, except as administrator. That would be as a layperson before I ever went to seminary, mm-hmm. and then as a student, a graduate, alum, a faculty member, and now as an emeritus faculty member. And I've said for many years that I could never repay Perkins for what it has meant to my life all these years. Mm-hmm. For me, Perkins was a lifetime education. And I was a little bit hesitant to say this in front of Dean Kirby, that I could never repay Perkins. I think, well, maybe he'd just cut my salary in half in that case, so I didn't want to open the door to that. But it was absolutely a transformative experience to me.
And your principal teaching field was homiletics. That mm-hmm. was a skill which you mm-hmm. had mastered yourself. I will put that in. You were a very accomplished preacher, and I'm sure that your students benefited immeasurably from the instruction that you gave.
Well, preaching, it's a strange bird in a way, because you're, in some ways, at least as perceived by students and as felt by students, you're really grading their ego mm-hmm. As well as their performance. So there's a lot of ego that has to go into preaching, and you try to be aware of that as a teacher of homiletics. There's an old debate, I guess you could call it, whether or not teaching is caught or taught, and I've always maintained it's a little bit of both. A Lutheran theologian said one time that you can put music into, you can teach a musician to compose, but you cannot put music into the musician's head.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of true. That is to say that we're dependent upon the Holy Spirit for a sense of calling. And theological education really doesn't begin in the classroom. It doesn't begin at the Conference Board of Ordained Ministry. It begins with something deep and wondrous that we refer to as God's calling. And of course that's tested out during your theological training. But you begin with that and you try to shape that and develop that. So teaching, preaching is exciting, and it involves all the other disciplines, because to teach you need to know a little something about church history. You need to be involved in pastoral care. And that's why it's difficult to grade preaching, because it is a rather sterile setting. And I've always said you really can't grade preaching apart from the pastoral context in which that takes place. But everybody has sort of an equality of inconvenience, I guess, at that point, so we do the best we can.
Now, you held an endowed chair, the Levan Chair in homiletics, but you were not the only homiletics professor at the time. Who were your colleagues?
No, John Holbert was a colleague, and of course remains at Perkins and is in our Lois Perkins chair, I believe. And Zan Holmes has been part-time and continues in that capacity. And then James Wharton, a Presbyterian, came the same year that I did. And so we really had a total of 4 of us, if you count Zan as full-time. And we learned a lot from each other. I learned particularly a lot from John Holbert, because his office was next to mine, and he is acquainted with the Hebrew language. And is a voracious reader, and has just a wonderful sense of humor. So we really enjoyed officing next to each other.
Well, that was a distinguished quartet, which you were a part.
Well, and we taught preaching in different ways. Usually you'd have a preaching lab of 10 or 11 students, but for a while there we had a methodology by which we would all start as a whole class, and we would give lectures, taking turns doing that, so we would hear each other give lectures as well as the students hearing that. And then we would break into small preaching labs as the time went on.
Sounds like a very creative approach.
Well, it was exciting.
Yeah. Well, I know that throughout your career you've had a very strong social interest, and I'd like to explore that a little bit, but maybe we could begin by going back to 1954 again. There were some interesting things happening in the seminary at that time with Dean Merriman Cunningham. Do you have some recollections of that period that you'd like to share with us?
I do. Dean Cunningham recruited a group of 5 African-American students, and they came to school, and one of those students was Cecil Williams of Glide Foundation Church of San Francisco fame. As I recall it, Cecil was a senior when I was a first-year student.
That's right.
But this was a major move, not only for the seminary, but for the university itself, that this actually preceded much that then occurred in the civil rights movement in the South. So it was a bold movement done rather quietly at the time. So that was an exciting milieu of our education. In addition to that, I suppose a lot of classes think of their time at school as being the golden era, not only because they were there or because of their classmates, but because of the faculty. But I do believe that about Perkins, those years from 54 to 57 and on either side. Schubert Ogden and John Deschner came just, I believe, a year or so after we started in 54. And of course Albert Outler was there, and Fred Gailey, and many others that I could name. But it was just an incredibly exciting time. Joe Matthews and Edward Hobbs. I suppose Joe Matthews probably had more influence than almost anybody. And if we have time, I'll tell you a Matthew story. Would that
Go,
be
yes,
appropriate?
please do.
Well, like the first days in class, Joe Matthews comes to class late, I think deliberately, just to show who's boss. And then he comes around the room and stalks us a bit without saying a word. And so finally he opens his mouth, and these were to be the first words that we were to hear in theological education. And I left Continental Oil Company to hear this, so I leaned forward in my seat to hear these first words. And they were, "If you've never been to Waxahachie, you've never been to Waxahachie, but you will." Well, we were just completely stunned. I was thinking, give me a break, what is this about? Well, he kept repeating this phrase from time to time throughout the semester, never did tell us what it meant, didn't have to, because finally our neophyte, newly in the process of being honed theological minds, began to realize that Waxahachie, for whatever reason, was Matthew's code word for being up against it. Mm-hmm. If you've never been to Waxahachie, you've never been to Waxahachie, but you will. And of course, Joe taught out of this strong existentialist method,
yes.
And his classrooms were just living drama. I mean, they just went by like that. So I would say probably I'm indebted to Joe as much or more of any of my professors.
Mm-hmm. He was an attention getter, that's for sure.
He really was, really was. And he either was greatly liked and admired, even if somewhat feared by students, or just detested by students. There wasn't much middle ground with Joe. But Joe was a person who could really live out the gospel in the classroom and could help deliver you from your moralisms and legalisms. And so it was a very, very enriched fare that he gave us in the classroom.
The existentialist pitch.
Absolutely. And Edward Hobbes opened up the New Testament for me. We were doing existentialist studies, and of course Ogden was doing that in theology, and his work with Bultmann, and then with Whitehead and Hartshorne and so-called process theology. So there was just a lot of ferment going on at that time in theology and in the life of Perkins School of Theology.
I was talking the other day with Jim Kirby, and he was remembering the coffee hours that we had during those days. Was that a time of...
Well, I don't remember those as well because I'm not a coffee drinker.
Oh, I see. Well,
I never have liked coffee, but yes, there were some great conversations during those times.
Yeah. But I don't know how crucial the coffee was, but there was a scheduled break in the class schedule, and nearly all the students and all the faculty gathered there, and there were some very stimulating conversations that went on at that time.
It was a rich time.
Mm-hmm. I was recalling too that mentioning the 5 African American students, they were recruited before the Supreme Court decision in 1954 outlawing segregation. Mm-hmm. And the first graduating class was, as you said, at the end of yours and my first year. Mine on the faculty and yours in the student body. So they graduated in 1955. Mm-hmm.
I want to add something else about theological education. As I said, it doesn't begin in the classroom, and it doesn't end there, of course. During that time, I was privileged to be a student assistant pastor at Highland Park Methodist Church, where I'd grown up under Marshall Steele and Bill Dickinson. Yes. The first year, part of my duties consisted of working with the university students in a university class. And then the second year, they put me with the senior highs, and the third year with the junior highs. I think they were figuring out my mentality, Neil. But also involved was visitation for shut-ins and people convalescing from illnesses. And that was a very rich part of my theological education. There are times when you just need to get out of the classroom, get away from the books, and experience people. That's right. And particularly some of these folks who had certainly seen their best days, health-wise at least, and in some ways in relationships because they'd lost loved ones. They're just filled with wisdom, and you learn so much there then, so it becomes a kind of a cycle of book learning enriched by life learning, and then the life learning enriches the book learning. And so that was a very indispensable part of my theological education.
And we've tried to structure that into the theological program with the field work and so on.
The intern program,
program.
very much. Another thing that I became involved in when I was a faculty member was the whole area of spiritual formation, which I now understand that Perkins has hired a full-time person, but every first-year student was required to be in a formation class once a week, and there was no credit for it, but it sort of added what I would call spiritual or devotional formation to intellectual and practical formation, which gave, I think, a more complete orbit of theological grounding. Because when I first started talking about spiritual formation as a seminary president at St. Paul, Methodist pastor would just kind of look at you,
yes,
goggle out, what are you talking about? And so this provided the seminary with an opportunity, along with worship in chapel, to invite students to reflect on their calling, and then to be exposed to some of the historic means of spiritual formation, or some of our grandparents might have just called it piety, but different ways of reading the scripture, fasting, which has had some prominence in the Wesleyan tradition, different ways of praying, retreats, in other words, how to nurture your own faith in a way, since all your ministry has to come out of your own faith. There's no other place for it to come out of. So I think that's been a strong addition to seminary education, and I think in some respects, some of us Protestants have learned from Catholics at that point.
Yes, I think that's probably so. Well, now you retired in what year?
I don't use the word retirement. We had a gerontologist at St. Paul who said, say redirection instead of retirement. And so, but yes, I became emeritus in 1993 when I was age 65. And then I followed that with some part-time work for 4 years with Will Finnan, our university chaplain, working with undergraduate students.
Well, I understand what you say when you don't believe in retirement, because you haven't really retired. You've been very, very active, and much of that in socially prominent causes. And could you tell us something about your interest and your enterprises there?
I'd be glad to. I've said for years to students that the continental divide in ordained ministry is the divide between charity and justice. And I'd like to say just a brief word about my own traveling in this way. And I can do this in 4 or 5 words that I use. I think when I first came to seminary, although I'd grown up in the church, when I was confronted with the kind of depth that you're asked to consider in seminary, I guess my first stage was just kind of duh. Now, in California, I understand duh means, well, everybody knows that, but I'm using duh in the sense that I just don't get this. You know, I was just kind of duh out to lunch. Then at Perkins, my duh went to an oh-oh, and the oh-oh was, am I going in the direction that the gospel, as I'm now beginning to understand it more fully, is calling me to go? And so that was the first critical theological reflection and analysis upon my life and my own priorities. And then at some point in there, the oh-oh went to aha. Aha, this is what the gospel is about reconciliation, about bringing people together, about various avenues of love. And then at some point, that aha went to a kind of a yes but, because the issue of justice is always more complicated and more controversial. And certainly the church, I think, does very well in the area of charity, and that has to happen. but we also have to ask, why are there 34 million people in poverty in the richest country the world has ever known? Why are there so many children that do not have health insurance, and many questions like that? So I really got my feet wet in justice areas when I was at St. Stephen and looking at school systems, and I actually threatened the school board with a lawsuit because we were shipping African American students up to Farney when we just built a new science lab and so forth at Mesquite High School. We had one little 3-room schoolhouse for 8 grades of African American children with no playground equipment and no American flag. And if we're going to fly the flag, we're going to fly it over all our people. So I got involved in that, and then when I went to North Haven, of course, we were into the whole civil rights thing, just full swing. We were into the Vietnam War, which I strongly opposed. I thought it was wrong for our people and certainly wrong for the people of Vietnam, and the fair housing kind of issues. So the gospel just led me to consider issues of justice and to try to work on those issues and to lead lay people, and sometimes they led me to be involved in these issues. So that's always been part of my ministry. And in Dallas, I've been related in different ways to the Dallas Peace Center, to the Greater Dallas Community of Churches, and Proyecto Adelante, which unfortunately no longer exists. But for 18 years we gave services to refugees from throughout the world, and those were all justice issues. And Fran worked in that area as well. So, lately I've been more concerned about the church's position on gay and lesbian people. I think the time will come, I don't know just when, but I do believe the position of the United Methodist Church will change, just as it changed with the ordination of women, just as it changed in relationship to African American and other people of color. It's just amazing when you think back about still after the Second World War, and you listen to great people like Bishop James Thomas, who couldn't stay at the same hotels as the other bishops or the other Methodists at a conference. They're just insane kind of thing. And I think the church will grow, and I think it will develop. And I think the day will come when the church will apologize to our gay and lesbian people. Not a popular issue, but in my book, a very important issue. For the past 3.5 years, I've been involved in doing ecumenical work through the Ecumenical Jubilee project. It's actually a project on a worldwide basis of the Roman Catholic Church, but it was made an ecumenical program or project in Dallas when a number of adjudicatory leaders signed a covenant at Thanksgiving Square back in 1997, and they appointed a committee to be a Jubilee committee, and then I ended up being the coordinator of that committee. So we've done a number of dialogues, and we support worship services and summer reading programs at the community of churches. Our last dialogue was just last month, in which we brought Reverend James Lawson from Los Angeles. Jim was very close to Martin Luther King in the civil rights time and was featured in a recent PBS program, A Force More Powerful, in which it showed segments from the life of Gandhi. It showed the economic boycott in South Africa, and then showed Jim's work in Nashville, in which he trained all of the Fisk students and other African American students to do the nonviolent sit-ins and the lunch counters, and eventually opened up the department stores in Nashville as a whole. So that was an exciting dialogue for us.
Well, indeed, you are not retired. How could you
well,
be?
As long as my health holds up, I want to try to use the life that God has given me, hopefully for the benefit, for the common good. That's the commonwealth of God.
Well, your commitment is an admirable one, and it's one actually that I wish more university people, not just at SMU, but nationwide, would take more seriously. Of course, our first responsibility is to develop our skills and our discipline and teach our students, but all of our work has some implication for a better society. And I wish that more of our faculty members would find a niche somewhere to make the applications of what they know and understand to the strengthening of our society.
And it may be that more do that certainly than I realize, but I think you're right, and certainly in the field of preaching, I've always felt that preaching sort of sets the tone for the mission and the activity of the local church. And so learning to preach in a prophetic way that doesn't just turn people off, hopefully it may do that, but hopefully in a way that are engaging, that are sort of self-confessional, in ways that draw people into conversation rather than just turning people off, is an art in itself. So that's one way that happens, and I think all of our disciplines certainly can lead in that direction.
Well, having heard you preach a number of times, I recognize that you're a good practitioner of what you're advocating.
Well, I had a member at St. Stephen, if I can remember her quote, because I always liked it. She said that your sermons were not always easy to hear, but they were not easy to swallow, but they were always nourishing. And so I like that. And another comment was that you never backed us into a corner with absolutes. You know, that you invite people to think and reflect because they're going to make up their own minds.
Yes, yes.
And my job is to try to do the homework and exegetical work, interpretive work, as best I know how to represent what I believe is the Word of God on a certain issue.
Well, what are your reflections about SMU at the present time? Anything that you want to share with us as to how the university is doing, where it's going, where you wish you would go?
Neill, I'm sure there's a lot more I don't know than I do know, but what I do know leads me to think that the university is in many ways moving well into the 21st century. I know that building is just one measuring stick, but if that's even a partial measuring stick, with all the new building, which represents services to both faculty and students, I think that has to be a plus to the university. And certainly the huge capital funds campaign is just a marvelous thing that I think our present administration has helped to bring about. I think somehow that the talents that SMU has needed have been provided at the right time. Kenneth Pye was the right president, I think, during the football scandal, a no-nonsense person, and brought many, many needed gifts to the university. And I think President Turner is doing that in different and new ways as the time calls for. Now, not being an active faculty member now, I don't know all the machinations that go on about the pros and cons of some of those things. So that's why I say I'm sure there's a lot that I don't know. But from what I do know, and I'm certainly continue to be excited about Perkins. I think Perkins is an outstanding school in many, many ways. So I'm thrilled at the way it reaches out. They do an annual conference for youth ministers. I don't know how many people know that now, but I've been privileged to teach in that last year and will again in January. And they have every conceivable course you can imagine for youth ministers, including for beginning ministers, youth ministers, and those who have been around for quite a while. And they have the annual summer school for church musicians. So I mean, they just reach many audiences.
Well, I hope we have a great future, and it does seem that we're moving well. This capital funds campaign is the most ambitious ever in the history of the university, and we're all elated that it is succeeding as well as it is. You can't have a great university without the funds to support it, but that's not all it needs, and there's a great deal more there too that we both appreciate over the years and now.
One of my hopes and dreams for the university as it moves on into the 21st century is to develop additional scholarships and endowed chairs for people of color, for people like Tutu or Mandela, people throughout the world who have made basic changes, because obviously we are in a shrinking world neighborhood. And I think those things make a difference to all of our students, both Anglo and students of color.
You would hope that we could bring people of that sort to the campus. Is that the idea?
That, and also to have scholarships in their names,
In their name,
and to
I
have
see.
endowed chairs in their names.
Yeah, that could be done even if they were not available to come.
Of course, of course.
That's a very creative idea. Well, are there other things that you'd like to bring into the conversation here?
Well, Neill, I want to thank you for your services to the university. Somebody, have they interviewed you?
Yes.
Well, I was going to say they certainly ought to do that, because you've added so much and still do to the university. I've enjoyed having a term on the, I guess you call it, is it the Retired Faculty?
Retired Faculty
Board.
Association.
I
yes.
think I'm going off that board now, but and I haven't been as active on it as I would like to be because of these other responsibilities. But that's certainly been a privilege and a joy to be part of that.
Well, it's a relatively active group, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of it. And we'll be calling on you, though. Even though you don't have the time, you'll probably have to find some.
Well, as you can see, I'm red and blue.
Red and blue, right. Well, it's been a great pleasure to spend this time with you and hear your story. And you certainly have brought a great deal to the university and beyond the university to the community. And we are grateful to you for all of your contributions.
Well, thank you, Neill. That's very generous.
And we will hope that the relationship between you and the university continues close and strong for the
I couldn't imagine it being
future.
otherwise. I
Good.
sure couldn't. Yeah.
Thank you much for being here with us.
Thank you, Neill. Appreciate it.